Hello, everyone. My name is Elisa Ewan, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Teachers College. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for the Alumni Career Development Webinar Series featuring alumna Lois Jeffers. The webinar series covers a range of career topics and includes speakers from a variety of backgrounds. The series is co-sponsored by TC Next and the Alumni Relations Office. Videos of past webinars are available on our website at www.tc.edu/alumni/career-webinars. Although many of us are staying at home right now, we are so grateful to our alumni experts who have stepped forward to offer digital programs that will continue to bring the TC community together to learn, share, and connect with one another. Today, Lois presents Activating Inclusive Leadership, a Roadmap. Lois Jeffers is a diversity business partner in the tech industry and leads the execution of the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy for Google's finance portfolio. Prior to joining Google, she was the lead diversity and inclusiveness consultant for the financial services advisory practice at Ernst & Young. Lois has also worked as the D&I consultant at Velo Carp Consulting and began her career as an attorney in the litigation department of Paul, Price, Wifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. Immediately after law practice, she served as a career advisor at the Columbia Law School, where she helped law students prepare for professional practice. Lois was a 2018 92nd Y Woman Empower Fellow and has also served as a volunteer at the Posse Foundation. She holds an AB from Lafayette College, a JD from Fordham University School of Law, and an MA in Social Organizational Psychology from TC. Lois has provided a handout which you can find the link to in the chat box. Please download it now as we will be going over it during the webinar. We will be having a few discussion questions, so please feel free to submit your answers in the chat box. If you have any audio or technical issues, feel free to chat me directly in the chat box as well. And without further ado, here's Lois.
Thank you, Elisa, for this opportunity to have this very timely discussion on inclusive leadership with this group. We are definitely in unprecedented times with a global health pandemic and a country being called to task to dismantle systems of oppression and racism that have existed for years. But while the challenges around diversity, equity, and inclusion are not new, there is a sense of urgency for individuals to recontract how they show up in this space so that their actions are visible, consistent, and impactful. So today we're going to talk about what it means to be an inclusive leader and unpack some of the common traits that inclusive leaders embody. Here's what we'll cover over the next hour. We'll first spend some time ensuring we all have the same foundation, specifically highlighting data points that support the business case for inclusion. I'll then review common derailers that get in the way of leading inclusively. And finally, I'll walk you through an inclusive leadership framework developed by Deloitte that outlines 6 key inclusive leadership traits. As we discuss these 6 traits, you'll have an opportunity to engage in self-reflection to begin building your personal roadmap to leading inclusively. Before we unpack why inclusion matters, I'd like to start with a reflection. I'm going to ask that you take a few minutes to think about this question and jot a few thoughts, and I'll ask for a few volunteers to share their responses in the chat box. So think about this question. Think about a time you observed someone leading inclusively. What behaviors did they engage in? So I'll repeat the question. Think about a time you observed someone leading inclusively. What behaviors did they engage in? So take a few minutes, jot some thoughts down, and then I'll ask for volunteers to share some of their thoughts in the chat box. Okay, I see a couple of responses come in. Thank you for those sharing. So I'm going to read a few of these. Welcoming multiple perspectives. Everyone in our staff meetings are called on. Non-aggressive. Taking the time to learn everyone's name. Listened more than spoke. Active listening. Analyzing the topic from different perspectives. Good listener. Absolutely. These are all behaviors of an inclusive leader. Developing a welcoming environment, curiosity, collaboration. Absolutely. So the responses you've shared really speak to the underlying elements of inclusive leadership. So when we think about inclusive leadership, it's really about fostering fairness and respect, creating an environment where individuals are valued and have a strong sense of belonging. And also one in which individuals can do their best work and have equal opportunities to succeed. So thank you for sharing those responses, and you'll see many of what you've shared echoed in our conversation later in the latter part of our discussion today around the traits inclusive leaders embody. So it's also important to understand what inclusive leadership is not. Inclusive leadership it's not about showing up because everyone else is showing up. In this age of social media where everyone is under, I'd say, increased scrutiny, there's sometimes this tendency to just say the words, but there are no follow-up actions, or the actions actually aren't aligned with our verbal commitments. Some of you may be familiar with the phrase performative allyship. And this really occurs, right, when individuals simply express outrage, disbelief, or anger at injustice, but there's no real acknowledgement of systemic issues and personal responsibility. Inclusive leadership is also not a singular act. It requires consistency and time. It's also not always comfortable. To lead inclusively means that you will have to step outside of your comfort zone time and time again. You'll make mistakes, you won't always get it right, and not everyone will initially buy into the actions that you promote and engage in that are aimed at creating more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workspaces. Finally, I would also argue that anyone, regardless of your rank or role, can engage in many of the behaviors we'll talk about today. For those of you who are in leadership roles in your organizations, the more you model these behaviors and the impact of these behaviors are observed in your organizations, people who don't necessarily hold leadership roles are more likely to follow in your footsteps. Now moving on to why inclusion matters. There are numerous reports and studies that speak to the underlying business case of diversity and inclusion. These reports have shown that inclusion has benefits at all levels, the individual level, the team level, as well as the organization as a whole. We know that when a company's workplace culture is inclusive, employees are more likely to experience job satisfaction and remain with the company. Teams also greatly benefit from inclusive workplace cultures. One study found that there was a 59% increase in innovation and creativity and a 49% increase in problem solving. Research also shows that customers are more likely to purchase products from a company that's more inclusive. So companies with highly inclusive cultures were found to outperform S&P average annual stock return. So the business case is incredibly important to understand no matter where you are on your inclusive leadership journey. But if creating inclusive workplaces has all of these benefits, why is it often so difficult to lead inclusively? I would say most people have positive intent and most people want to do the right thing. And many organizations have established processes and systems to identify and mitigate gaps, albeit some more successfully than others. But what is it about an individual's mindset or behaviors that prevent them from taking action? Based on my experience, here are a few common derailers that are important to be aware of. So fear of making a mistake, shame or guilt about a prior inaction or mistake, centering yourself instead of the most impacted, explaining away data, this focus on equality versus equity, and finally, invalidating the feelings and perspectives of others. I want to just drill down on a few of these. Regarding the first two derailers on this list, I would say many of us can probably remember a time when we used the wrong word, when we didn't speak up, when we saw someone being treated unfairly, or maybe we didn't challenge inequitable practices, or someone calls us out on a mistake. The emotions that are triggered because of these mistakes, the shame, the guilt, the fear, often lead to inaction. But as inclusive leaders, it's really imperative that we don't get stuck in these emotions. A few tips I'd like to offer to help individuals move past inaction to action is first simply trying to understand where your guilt or emotions are coming from. And I think also recognizing that when you're being challenged or called out on a specific behavior, you are really simply being asked to consider the impact of your words or actions. So the greater your awareness, the more likely you can avoid repeating these actions. Sometimes when having conversations around equity, there is a tendency to not center the experiences and perspectives of those most impacted. What does this actually look like? It's the act of shifting the lens away from the topic at hand so that you're more comfortable, or even sharing your experiences rather than truly listening to someone else's experience. Inclusive leaders accept that these conversations are uncomfortable. When you find yourself engaging in this common derailer, practice decentering by asking these questions. Who is this for? Is it to make me feel better or less guilty? Am I using my own experience to tell someone how they should feel? And finally, does what I'm saying change the topic of conversation? The final derailer I'd like to touch on is this concept of equity versus equality. I found that the terms are often used interchangeably, but are in fact different. And failure to recognize the distinction can often hinder the development and progression of programs focused on creating equity. Equality is certainly about treating everyone the same. So basically ensuring that everyone has the same things to be successful. It's similar to equity in the sense that it's seeking fairness for everyone, right? And that's what we want. But the distinction is that it sometimes assumes everyone starts at the same place or has the same support. Equity, on the other hand, is about giving everyone what they need to be successful. So it means not necessarily giving everyone the exact same thing, but rather giving them enough to level the playing field so everyone has the same opportunity to succeed. Okay, so now that we have the same foundation, let's talk about the inclusive leadership traits. There are several frameworks in the DEI space that provides insight into the skills and behaviors or traits integral to inclusive leadership. The framework we'll be using today, as I've mentioned earlier, was developed by Deloitte, specifically using or through the review of literature and interviews of over 1,500 employees. The Deloitte model outlines what they refer to as 6 signature traits that inclusive leaders embody. These 6 traits are visible commitment, courage, awareness of bias, cultural intelligence, curiosity, and collaboration. These traits are actually interrelated and build on each other. Let's look at each one in more detail, starting first with commitment or visible commitment. So not surprisingly, the first trait in this model is commitment. Diversity, equity, and inclusion works takes a lot of time and energy. And I think we are all aware that it often fails because of a lack of commitment and follow through. Many leaders make verbal DEI commitments, which are great, but they often fall flat because they aren't compelling and may come across as inauthentic. And I would say that in many scenarios, the leader has failed to articulate their personal why and the organization's business case for DEI. And when I say your personal why, I'm really referring to your diversity narrative. Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important to you? And why are you personally committed to promoting it? It's not enough to say, I'm committed. Inclusive leaders need to engage in self-reflection and show that their commitment to DEI is grounded in personal experience. People in your organization are more likely to connect to your personal stories. And equally important, inclusive leaders need to have a competent understanding of why DEI is imperative to their organizations. So that they've done their homework on how DEI impacts and improves their organization's culture, systems, and processes. I do want to spend a little bit of time on this idea of developing your personal why. I highly encourage anyone who's on this journey of understanding how to lead more inclusively to take time to develop your personal why. And here are a couple of questions to consider to help you develop your personal DEI narrative. First, I recommend considering your journey. When did these concepts become most salient for you? When did you first recognize you had privilege, right? And the advantages it afforded you? When did race become more salient for you? What was an experience that made you feel like an outsider? What did you learn? Looking back at my personal experience, I remember going away to college. I grew up in the Virgin Islands and grew up in a community where everyone looked like me. And going away to college, I attended a predominantly white institution, and I was one of 100 Black students on campus of a population of 2,000 students. And I remember attending first day of orientation and looking around and not seeing anyone who looked like me. So for the first time in my life, I was seen as a minority. And that was something that really triggered my desire to work in this space. So think about your journey. When did all of these concepts really become more salient for you? Second, what are the specific experiences that demonstrate your commitment? And lastly, what's your vision? Share your vision of the future. How do you see yourself as a change agent in this space? And not just today or this year, but next year or 5 years from now. So these, I would say, these are the stories and examples that can help people connect to you and engenders trust in your commitment to doing this work. The second inclusive leadership trait is courage. At its core, this trait is about humility. There is an internal and external component. Inclusive leaders have the courage to look inwards. They don't shy away from personal limitations, and they ask for feedback on growth areas. Externally, there's a willingness to challenge attitudes and practices that are not aligned with equity inclusion. And they hold others accountable, even if it's uncomfortable. The third trait is awareness of bias. Inclusive leaders are aware of personal and organizational blind spots. To lead inclusively, leaders have to be proactive about understanding their personal biases and also invest in the time to understand the conditions in your organizations that make policies, processes, and systems most susceptible to bias. So they ask questions like, am I giving this individual more visibility because they're like me? Why are we seeing lower promotion trends for this particular group? Why are individuals in this demographic group leaving at higher rates than average? Are we evaluating this individual based on objective or subjective measures? But I would say that self and organizational awareness, it's only one part of the puzzle. Inclusive leaders move beyond building awareness. They also take action to mitigate bias, helping to either implementing or sponsoring interventions that encourage fair play. It's also important to understand common types of biases. So I want to walk through a couple of biases that should be on your radar. The first is anchoring bias. So this bias involves placing more weight on the first piece of information available to us. For example, you receive a memo written by someone new on your team, and there are a few grammatical errors. When this bias is in play, even if every other memo you receive from this individual is grammatically correct, your brain anchors on your first experience with this individual, which ultimately may impact further evaluations or interactions. Another common bias is in-group bias. So this shows up when we have an affinity for others who are part of a group we belong to. For example, let's say you're interviewing two candidates and one of the candidates went to the same college you've attended. You might be more likely to move this individual forward in the interview process as opposed to the second candidate simply based on educational affinity. The third bias, attribution bias, occurs when someone who's received negative feedback on performance is more likely to attribute it to external factors rather than an internal factor. So it's a form of self-protection. Individuals we just sometimes have difficulty objectively perceiving our behaviors. So for example, let's say we're driving and someone cuts us off. Our first thought might be, oh, what a jerk, instead of maybe considering alternate possibilities, like the driver might be rushing someone to the hospital. On the flip side, though, when we cut someone off in traffic, we tend to convince ourselves that we had to do so. This bias is also intensified when coupled with in-group favoritism. It could result in positive attribution for a member of your in-group and negative attribution for those who are not part of that group. And the last bias I want to just talk about today is confirmation bias. This occurs when we focus on data that confirms a pre-existing belief. For example, if you think an individual or a group of people are less competent, any mistake individuals in that group makes confirms that pre-existing belief. You may also look more diligently for mistakes by individuals in that group. Biases are just one of the most insidious barriers to equity in the workplace and are often overlooked, often dismissed due to a lack of awareness or simply how we operate in organizations. We're all moving so quickly, trying to meet demands and put out the best work product. But that often increases the likelihood of bias creeping into decision making. So as inclusive leaders, there is just a need to be hyper vigilant about mitigating bias. And one easy tool you can implement before decision making is pausing, reflecting, and asking 3 questions. What am I truly observing? What's the truth here? What's actually going on? What am I missing? And what assumptions am I making? Okay, so now that we've walked through the first 3 traits, I do want to just take a minute and pause and give you some time to reflect on where you are and where you'd like to be. An abbreviated worksheet was provided prior to the webinar. Elisa also, I believe, included a link in the chat box. If you don't have access to the worksheet, that's okay. You can answer questions on a blank sheet of paper. So for this exercise, I'm going to ask you to focus on the third trait, awareness of bias. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, maybe 5 to 7 minutes to answer these questions. You don't have to go into a ton of detail. This is really just practice, right? We're developing this muscle. So take a couple of minutes, answer these questions, and maybe focusing on 3 questions. Where is there room for improvement? How will I improve capability? And how will I hold myself accountable? Take a few minutes, answer these questions, and we'll ask for volunteers to share some of their responses in the chat box. Okay, take about another minute to wrap up. And as you're wrapping up, I'm going to ask for a couple of volunteers to share their responses in the chat box. But I'd like you to specifically share in the chat box answers to 2 questions. How you'll improve your capability. So one example of what you come up with in terms of improving your capability, and how you will hold yourself accountable. So how you'll improve your capability and how you will hold yourself accountable, if you feel comfortable sharing those responses in the chat box. Thank you, Rochelle. So Rochelle will hold herself accountable by writing her biases down, and after a few weeks of reflection, see how my behavior has changed. Absolutely, Rochelle. So putting pen to paper is incredibly important. So self-reflection is one piece of this. Writing your biases down, observing also where you are seeing improvement in your behaviors. To be less judgmental. Absolutely, that takes time and effort, observing where we're being more judgmental versus taking a more objective view of things. Being more clear in feedback and suggestions. Oh, accountability partner, absolutely. Oftentimes it's hard to keep ourselves accountable, right? So identifying one person or a couple of individuals who help us to stay on track. Working to recognize when you're holding back because you feel these intense emotions like shame. Absolutely. Getting to know others and their professional aspirations. Yeah, it's really important, right, as leaders or individuals, that we are taking the time to build connections and understand people from all aspects of individuals that we're working with. Being reflective at the end of the day. Shifting mindset from judger to learner, being curious, asking more questions. Curiosity is definitely one of the leadership traits we'll be talking about today. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, thank you all to everyone who shared their responses. I hope that this was a helpful exercise as you begin to develop your roadmap. I definitely recommend we'll do another trait as I walk through the remaining 3 traits and give you another opportunity to self-reflect. But we do hope that after this discussion, you'll take the time to complete this, the full worksheet, which you'll be receiving at the conclusion of this discussion. So now turning back to our the remaining 3 traits. The 4th trait is curiosity. Someone mentioned curiosity in the chat a few minutes ago. Curiosity in highly inclusive leaders translates to openness to different ideas and experiences. So you're really proactive about building those connections, and you're interested in continuous learning. You don't only rely on your judgment, right? Think about the leaders that you engage with who lack this trait and the perspectives and opinions that they're missing out on. They tap the same people. They have a fixed mindset rather than a growth mindset. You know, a few questions to ask yourself, right, when we think about this trait, right? Whose voice is missing? What additional perspective do I need to be more effective in this space? The 5th trait involves cultural intelligence, right? So it's really about the ability to effectively navigate culturally diverse settings. Inclusive leaders have a keen understanding of how their own culture impacts their worldview, and how, say, stereotypes can influence their perceptions and expectations of others. There's also a really high tolerance of ambiguity, given their ability to navigate spaces that are often unfamiliar and uncomfortable. They're able to adapt because they pay attention, right? Paying attention to behavioral and communication cues. And simultaneously, I think this is really important, they don't overcompensate in areas where they're not as strong. To enhance this trait, I recommend thinking about placing yourself in situations where you have the opportunity to observe and interact with others from different backgrounds and being intentional about it. Identify external conferences. Obviously, everything now is virtual, or internal employee resource group events that are appropriate for you to attend. And when you attend, when you're online, proactively engaging, right, experiencing and connecting with those who might be from different backgrounds than you are. The final trait is collaborative or collaboration. And it's very much tied to, I would say, the actions that individuals undertake to create an environment where everyone feels comfortable contributing without fear of retribution or embarrassment. So inclusive leaders create psychological safe environments. They find opportunities to leverage diverse thinking and perspectives by inviting all team members to share ideas in some format or venue, whether that is in a meeting, going around the room and asking everyone to share an idea, or prior to the meeting, sending out an email and asking for ideas or topics, right? Understanding that folks show up differently, right? And have different comfort levels in how they share ideas or contribute to discussions. They understand that diversity of thinking is a key element of collaboration. And they also understand the importance of setting up team rules of engagement that encourages calling out and holding others accountable for exclusionary behavior. So think about your current environment. What are the norms and processes that you have contributed to or encourage that enables collaboration? Okay, so what I'd like to do, we are going to return to the roadmap. Again, if you don't have the worksheet, that's fine. Utilize a sheet of paper that you used a couple of minutes ago. I want to give you another opportunity to self-reflect. This time, we're going to focus on collaboration or collaborative, the last trait. So please take a couple of minutes to reflect on these questions and provide responses. And similar to the first exercise, I'm going to ask for volunteers to share your responses in the chat box if you're comfortable doing so. So take a couple of minutes, reflect on these questions. Again, we're just practicing, so it doesn't have to be very detailed, but think about how you'd respond to these questions. So where is there room for improvement? How might you improve capability? Are there specific scenarios that would enable you to do so? How are you going to hold yourself accountable? So I'll pause and let the group reflect, and we'll come back together in a couple of minutes. Okay, so can we have a few volunteers to share what you came up with? Again, if you can focus on one way you'll work to improve your capability and how you will hold yourself accountable. If you can share a couple of responses in the chat box so that we can see and respond and learn from each other. So, okay, we see a couple of responses coming in. Asking for suggestions from our out group, right? So expanding your network and getting feedback from those outside of your network. Delegating helps improve capability, absolutely. So It's also about trusting individuals to do the work. So developing that trusting environment. Yeah, trusting the experts on my team and group knowledge. Regularly touching base with all team members, absolutely important. I think too often we touch base with those who are like us, our go-to people, but how are we really building those relationships and understanding the experience of everyone on our team? Real collaboration happens when all parties hold themselves and each other accountable. And I would say as inclusive leaders, you can certainly model holding others accountable. When folks on your team see that that is an expectation, they're more likely to follow suit. For improvement, aligning my work and having a clear shared vision at the beginning of a project, as it will serve as purpose as to why we're doing the work. Absolutely. Addressing uncomfortable comments or language at the time. Yeah, real in-time feedback. So again, setting those expectations of what the norms will be for your team and organization. That exclusionary behavior, uncomfortable or discriminatory comments is not acceptable. Any other comments or responses before we move on? Being more cognizant of language that is used in the workplace to create in-out groups. Yeah, it's amazing, right? The language, how language can create those distinctions and make people feel like they're outsiders or insiders. Really great insight. Okay. Okay, well, thank you all for your responses. Again, I encourage you to complete this worksheet, the full worksheet, which will be shared with you, and use it regularly as a pulse check. So a few final thoughts before we open up for Q&A. Each of you are at different stages of this journey to lead more inclusively, and that's okay. While we recognize that organizational and interpersonal benefits of leading inclusively, and we recognize that there are great benefits to the organization and individuals, I think it's also important to recognize that it's not a one and done skill. It's a skill you'll continue to build and finesse as you learn more about self-reflection. You learn more through self-reflection and the feedback that you receive from others. I encourage you to take time to reflect and complete questions in this worksheet. And once you've outlined all of your commitments, share those commitments over the next few weeks with a few people and ask them to provide feedback on your progress at, let's say, the 60-day or 90-day mark. Also recommend or encourage you to share your learnings with your teams and organizations, right? Doing so, again, shows your commitment, shows your interest, shows your desire to lead more inclusively on your teams. Before we open up the discussion to questions, I also want to highlight just a couple of resources that you might find helpful. I've included 3 books that touch on topics relating to leading inclusively and having conversations around race, or how to be an inclusive leader, the person you mean to be, and so you want to talk about race. There are many resources available, but here are just a few that you can start with. I'm sure some of you have seen or read some of these resources. And I've also included 2 Harvard Business Review articles. One discusses how leaders can interrupt bias on teams, and the second shares strategies that you can utilize to talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So with that being said, that's the end of our presentation, but we do want to use the remaining few minutes to take questions that you might have.
Hi, everyone. So we are now in the Q&A portion of the presentation. So if you have any questions for Lois, please feel free to put them in the Q&A pane, which you should be able to find below. So Lois, we did get some questions in already. And the first question we have is, how do you approach superiors about beginning the conversation of DEI in the workplace if there's been little or to no effort towards inclusivity or equity thus far?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes with this work, you do need leadership buy-in. I recommend thinking about what are sort of key drivers for these leaders or the organization. Is it data, right? If this is a data-driven organization, helping leaders to understand where there are gaps using data, whether it's be around representation, attrition, promotion trends, and then also using external data, right? So showing the business case for diversity and inclusion using research and studies that have been really highly circulated in the space. So there are a lot of resources. So starting there. And then also maybe thinking about, sometimes I think the messenger matters, right? Is there someone who believes in the importance of promoting inclusiveness and diversity in the workplace, who could serve as the messenger, right? That superior supervisor might be more likely to respond to.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have is, one of our attendees recently attended a meeting where a white woman spoke about her experiences being discriminated against in a DEI listening session, including talking about being a minority as a white woman living in Japan at one time. She understands her intent of aiming to share the experience, but it didn't land well with her and the others on the call.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any thoughts on how to give feedback balancing her intent of wanting to share and be vulnerable with the group, but also coaching her on her tone and the importance of recognizing her privilege in a given situation?
Yeah, that's such a great example of intent versus impact. I think I think you sort of answered it a little bit in your question. This leader did not recognize the impact of her story on those who attended the session. So I think it's important to share the impact. I don't know if that has been done. She may be completely unaware of how this landed. And I think it's important to share feedback on these types of topics. So you may not be the right person to share that feedback, but is there someone else in the organization who'd be better positioned to share that feedback? I don't know what your relationship is. It may not be one that would allow for that type of conversation, but I think the first step is actually sharing that feedback, how it impacted the individuals, and really also starting with the question of, how did you think that went? How do you think your story landed on individuals who were in that room? So again, I do think it's important to share the impact.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, I'm very curious if the traits of an inclusive leader looks different for folks who are diverse practitioners, i.e. people of color. If so, what are the ways that they differ?
That's a good question. I would think not. These traits were identified, as I mentioned, using research, but also interviewing individuals from many different backgrounds. So I think these traits are agnostic of background, and they're traits that I think everyone should be thinking about as you're developing your inclusive leadership skills.
Great, thank you. So earlier you mentioned that self-reflection and feedback are key to learning how to become a more inclusive leader. How do you differentiate good feedback versus bad feedback?
Good question. Feedback is a gift, but too often in organizations, folks shy away from it. And um, so in organizations, one, right, when we think about a systems and processes perspective, there has to be this culture of feedback that is developed in organizations. But as we're thinking about what is good versus bad feedback, or good feedback is just in time. So it is delivered fairly quickly when someone behaves in a way that might be exclusionary. It's specific. So it provides clear examples of how someone's behavior might not have held up to the organization's standards around inclusiveness and diversity. And it also shares examples of maybe how that individual can improve. So specific, just in time, and providing examples of how folks could improve.
Great. So I think this will be our last question, but earlier we were talking about real-time feedback and letting them know if someone says something offhandedly that is just doesn't sit right with other people, making sure they let them know in real time and trying to address that issue. But that's such an awkward conversation to have. So do you have any advice on how to start those conversations to make sure that people are aware of the language that they're using and how it can impact others?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the messenger matters. And when I say just in time, it may not be in an ideal situation, it might be in that moment, but it may be a day later. But the way I approach feedback when I'm sharing, I'm really trying to come from a place of helping the other individual understand their impact. So I typically start by saying something like, you may not realize, you may not be aware of how this might have landed on XYZ, or something along the lines of, I am really invested in your growth, and I want you to be, a great leader, or I want you to be effective in this role. So I want to share some pieces of feedback based on your behavior or action. So couching it in language in terms of, I am invested in you, I'm rooting for you, I want you to do well, but also thinking about who might be the best messenger to deliver that feedback.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lois. If we didn't get to read out your question, I'm so sorry. We're just trying to be mindful of time, but you can find Lois on LinkedIn, and you can feel free to connect with her and share your questions with her via the messaging service. Lois, I just want to thank you so much for you taking the time to share your expertise with the TC community on this timely and such an important topic. So thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. Everyone, I just want to let you know that TC will be planning more digital events in the near future. So please stay tuned to emails from TC, Alumni Relations, and our social media channels. You will be receiving a link to this video presentation, as well as the full worksheet that Lois was talking about, in a follow-up email. This video will also be available on our website, and that address again is www.tc.edu/alumni/career webinars. We hope you can join us for our next webinar, Elevating Your Home for Virtual Learning this fall, with Karen Aronian on Wednesday, August 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.